All right, so I'm out here today. I thought the best way to do a review of the Diverge and the Crux was just to get them both out on the dirt and ride them back to back. I'm gonna do a lap on the Diverge, talk about it, a lap on the Crux and talk about it, and just give you my final opinions. Quick overview of these two bikes. So this is my Diverge and my Crux. The Crux is a little bit of a higher end build. It has carbon wheels. It has a 1x SRAM rival system electronic, and then the Diverge has a 2x GRX system. They are both running the Specialized Pathfinder tires. The Diverge has 42s, so slightly larger, and the Crux has 38s. The PSI in the Crux is about 55 or so PSI on the front and the rear, and the PSI on the Diverge is probably in your 40s. I can typically run quite a bit less on the Diverge, which makes for a softer experience, but overall similar setup. Both bikes are completely stock. I'm always of the opinion of buying a bike and riding it stock. I don't want to spend like a couple $1,000s on a bike and then have to add more money to it. So I will typically ride them stock unless there's something I really want to change. I did weigh both bikes prior to bringing them out here. Not a super official weight. My scale was just for luggage, but I thought I would just weigh them. So the Crux is about 18.5 pounds and the Diverge is about 20.5 pounds. So there's about a 2-pound difference between them both, which isn't substantial. I think the biggest difference is the wheels more than anything. The wheels are quite a bit lighter on the Crux and have a lot less rolling resistance, so you get a little bit more of an acceleration out of them. So one of the initial things you notice right off the bat from the Diverge to the Crux is how much smaller this frame feels. I don't know why specifically that is. I'm 6'1". I typically ride a 58, but this frame, it honestly feels like a 56 on the Diverge. The Crux feels like the right size. It feels like a 58 and would follow a road bike sizing really well. But the Diverge doesn't follow that same kind of thought process. It doesn't, I would size up, maybe I would size up depending on how tall you are. Like this is a 58 supposedly, and I could very easily ride a 60 on this. It honestly rides like a 56. Yeah, the sizing thing is one of the weirdest parts for me because they're both Specialized bikes, and you would assume like they would have very similar sizing characteristics, but they don't. This one definitely feels smaller. The frame size feels smaller than the Crux. So maybe take that into account as you're exploring these two bikes. You could definitely get away with riding either a smaller Crux or a bigger Diverge. This feels like a 56. Again, it's not, it's just a 58. The Diverge also feels more like a mountain bike at its core than the Crux does. So you sit, the front wheel sits out in front of you a little bit more, and it gives you more of that stable, I can just kind of plow through rough terrain feeling, not like a twitchy feeling. So when you're on the Crux, the steering, the handling feels very twitchy, whereas this, like on fast turns and things like that, I just can't take them as tight on the Diverge as I can on the Crux. The Crux allows you to take really fast moving turns and handling. Like I can get that bike really low on a turn and go really fast into a turn and things like that. The Diverge doesn't necessarily want to do that. It wants to stay more squared up, more straight. So the handling is significantly calmer on the Diverge, whereas the Crux you get kind of that thrilling, twitchy handling where you can, play with it, turn on a dime, whatever you want to do with that. The counter side to that is at high speeds, the Diverge definitely feels a lot more stable and safe, whereas the Crux, you really have to watch the handlebars. If you're not careful, it'll turn on you or it'll go wherever it wants. The Diverge really stays straight and comfortable and safe from that perspective. To my wife, if you end up watching this video, I'm sorry I'm late today. There was just a lot to say about these two bikes, and the people got to know. So sorry I'm late. Everyone, please subscribe so my wife isn't mad at me. I can tell her it was worth it. I would say overall between the two bikes, there's really not a difference on like top speed or how quickly you can go. Both bikes will go generally about the same speed, you know, pedaling on dirt as fast as you would want to go. The difference is the Diverge feels a lot safer, a lot more planted, whereas the Crux at high speed you're kind of hanging on for dear life. There is kind of that thrilling, fun element to the Crux, but it's definitely not like a smooth, safe, comfortable ride at high speeds. The Diverge is really that, like you can pedal 25 miles an hour on dirt and feel completely safe, whereas on the Crux you're, you know, kind of holding on to the handlebars for dear life. Where these bikes really start to separate themselves is on rough roads, really rough gravel terrain at high speeds. The Diverge gets into its comfortable spare and you're good to go. Whereas the Crux, the rougher it gets, you know, the little bit less comfortable you're gonna feel, a little bit less safe you're gonna feel. However, on the flip side of that, where the Crux can go on the road and feel like a road bike, the Diverge definitely cannot do that. You do notice it on the tarmac, on my road rides home. Like, I would much prefer to be on the Crux than the Diverge, just from that perspective of, you know, it's a more efficient, lighter, quicker, twitchier bike, and on the road that makes all the difference. So I'd say that's kind of the big area where it separates. When the road gets really smooth, you would definitely want to be on a Crux, whether that's an ultra smooth gravel road or whether you're on tarmac. Like if it's smooth, you want to be on the Crux, and then where it's rough, you want to be on the Diverge, right? That makes sense. That's what those bikes are built for. If I was getting into gravel for the first time, I'd have a long conversation with myself initially, like, what type of riding am I going to do? I have a full separate video on the Crux and why I bought that. But if you have any type of road riding that you want to do with your gravel bike, I wouldn't necessarily go for the Diverge. It'll do road biking, it's just not the same. Now, if you know like 90% of your time is going to be spent on the dirt, then yes, the Diverge is a no-brainer from that perspective. But if there's a certain element of you that's like, hey, maybe I want to do like more multi-purpose stuff and ride on different terrains and things like that, then I would explore, you know, a Crux or just something a little bit more multi-purpose focused. So we're approaching the single track section now, and the difference is, if I was on my Crux, I definitely try and avoid single track just because it spooks me on that bike. Whereas on the Diverge, I don't necessarily really care. I'll ride anywhere. But if I was on a Crux, I definitely wish I was on a mountain bike. But on this Diverge, I can definitely switch between the two and say, sure, I'll ride some single track. Won't love it, but it's definitely not scary or spooky. So that's the Diverge. About halfway through this loop, and just to give kind of my quick 2 cents on it, the Diverge is a dedicated gravel bike. I have a full separate video of the bike, the review, my thoughts on it. But if you're going to be gravel biking and that's what you want to do, get the Diverge. It'll serve you well. If there's kind of that ambiguity of, hey, I may want a road bike once in a while, I definitely wouldn't get the Diverge. It's just not efficient, it's not fun on the road. But as a dedicated gravel bike, like, you can't go wrong with it. I do understand why they put droppers on these gravel bikes. Like, when I first got into it, I was like, gravel bike with a dropper post, like, that's absurd. But as I've gone on, like, when you get out here and you go down some really rough spots, that seat, because it's, you know, high up compared to a mountain bike, it's right in the way, and it's a really limiting factor at going fast. Yeah, so see, like right here is a perfect example. It's a little bit rough, you're doing about 20 miles an hour, This bike, it's really comfortable right here. I feel safe. Like it's stable, it wants to keep going straight, like no complaints from that perspective. Whereas if I'm on the Crux, I'm going the same speed, but I'm definitely a little bit, you know, my adrenaline's running higher and I'm a little bit more scared from that perspective. I've had mixed opinions on the Future Shock, and I found it changes my opinion quite a bit over time of riding this bike. At first I was like, it doesn't really make a difference, like not necessary, you don't need the Future Shock. But I find that as I put more miles on it, it is nice to have. Like it's just that little bit of, you know, extra that makes the ride so much more comfortable, safer. You get a lot more traction on the front. And over time, you're like, wow, I really actually enjoy the shock, especially when you shift back to like a fixed bike, like the Crux or something stiff to ride on the gravel. You really notice it. And you're like, wow, I didn't realize how much of the vibrations that Future Shock is picking up, but going back to a regular bike now is hard just because you get used to it for so long. So we're gonna cruise down this final fire road and go over and switch to the Crux and get our opinions of that bike. Being the dummy that I am, I actually only brought one set of pedals to today's 2-bike review, so I have to switch pedals mid-ride, which is always a fun experience. All right, so we're starting loop 2 on the Crux. It's actually been a little while since I've ridden this bike, so we'll see how it goes. I've been riding the Diverge more recently just because it's newer, so my opinion should be pretty fresh of this bike. Yeah, so I just started second loop on the Crux, and you immediately notice how much rougher the trail is on this bike. You feel every bump, every rock, everything on this bike. Part of that is going to be the tires. So these are a lot skinnier than the ones in the Diverge, but this bike is also a lot stiffer. I would say overall, I am going a lot faster. My pace is higher, but it's definitely not smooth at all. That Diverge, you really take it for granted after riding it for a while, but it is a smooth bike. The handlebars are also a lot wider on this bike. The Diverge, you kind of sit more compact and you sit a lot lower. Talking about that frame on the Diverge, you definitely sit a lot lower to the ground. Smaller frame, lower. The front end's a lot more stable, but overall, like I can very easily put in a much higher pace with about the same effort, whereas on the Diverge, it is a little bit more sluggish, just pedaling up, you know, a normal road. I think more than anything, it's the tire pressure. So on the Diverge, I can get away with like 40 PSI, getting down to the 40s, maybe in the 30s, if I'm feeling brave. On this bike, mainly because I have the carbon wheels on it and I don't want to do any damage, but I typically run like 50 PSI or more. That 20-pound difference in tire pressure is going to make a huge difference on smoothness on like the semi-rough roads like this, the gravelly. Tire pressure is going to make all the difference. I bought the Crux knowing I would ride it 50-50 on the road and gravel, and to that end it works really well. Not the best on the gravel, but a good road bike as well. Now let's say fall more in love with gravel and want to do that more and more. I would probably lean towards a Diverge at this point. You could convince me that that would be the funner long-term ride. Yeah, see, I just did this on the Diverge and we're going about the same speed, but it's a lot rougher on this bike. You can see it in my hands getting vibrated. I like to ride out my front door to the trails, ride around in the dirt like this, and then I like to ride home on the road. And the Crux has met that category for me really well. The Diverge is close. It's a close second. You could convince me that if I put a really light set of carbon wheels on that bike, if I got a SRAM Eagle and a skinnier, lighter tire set, like, you could convince me to sell my Crux. But in that current build, kind of an entry-level spec, it works just as a gravel bike. Now I could upgrade that and definitely change that, but my wife wouldn't be happy about that, and I don't want to own multiple bikes, so I'll probably have to pick between one or the other and see what I keep long term. We're almost to the single track, and I'm not looking forward to it on this bike, on the Crux, mainly because I know it will require a lot of work from my lower back and just focus to get down the trail, get down the single track without, you know, getting hurt. Whereas on the Diverge, it's like, I'll just do it, no big deal. The Crux, you really have to be 100% on it. It's like driving a high performance vehicle. Like, you can't just play around or you'll get hurt. The Diverge, you can kind of just go wherever you want. This one you can too, but it does require a lot more focus than the other bike does. So here we are, same spot. There's the bench. This time I'm on the Crux. My quick 2 cents. The Crux is definitely that do-it-all bike. So if you know you're gonna do a lot of everything, road biking, gravel, a little bit of everything, the Crux is that bike. Not the best at any categories, but it will allow you to have a single bike and ride it everywhere as opposed to having multiple bikes. That's gonna be your biggest difference over the Diverge. The handlebar setup on the Diverge is more comfortable. It's more in, a little bit more compact, but I do feel like the handlebars on the Crux do allow a lot more control just because they're wider and you have a little bit more control on where you're kind of handling, especially on single track like this. Another perfect example of where I would love to have a dropper is on any type of single track on the Crux. The seat is definitely right in the way. Yeah, see, I'm like so focused this time that I can't even talk. Whereas on the Diverge, I was kind of chit-chatting down this section, but these skinny tires are a lot less safe than the 42s on the Diverge. So I just finished the long downhill section, and yeah, that's definitely a big area where you'll notice the difference. If it's a long, semi-rough, or even like a medium rough downhill gravel road, you would definitely want to be on the Diverge. It was probably the same speed, same amount of time over the two bikes to get down that, but I got rattled to pieces on the Crux. My lower back, you know, got a good workout. My neck and shoulders got a good workout. And you have to get to the bottom and like stretch out a little bit. Whereas on the Diverge, wider tires, future shock, it's like, hey, that was no big deal, just keep riding. It was rough, but it wasn't like, you know, killing your back or making you sore anywhere. It's all about the terrain you're gonna ride, how you're gonna ride, on what bike's gonna be best. Yeah, the disappointing thing on the Crux is the no-handed experience is not the same. For some reason, on that Diverge, I can take my hands off and ride forever in really any condition, and it doesn't want to tip over. So look, I just finished 2 laps on the Diverge and the Crux. I thought I'd just sit in the back of my truck and give you kind of my quick verdict on the 2 bikes. They're both good choices. Like, nothing nowadays is a bad choice. All bikes are going to be fun to ride. It really is a preference of where you're going to ride. For me personally, I do a fair amount of road biking and I like gravel biking, so the Crux checks that category really well, and it allows me to do both those things without owning 2 bikes. Now, if my wife would let me, sure, I would love to have like an expensive Diverge build alongside my expensive Crux build, but right now that's not a reality, so I got to pick one bike, and I'll probably end up sticking with the Crux just because I can ride more road and gravel, whereas the Diverge is not that same road experience. You don't get the same thrill, and it's not as fast or as efficient. However, if I lean towards the idea of like, hey, I'm long term, I'm going to fall more in love with gravel biking, and that's what I want to do, and I want to be, you know, out in the middle of nowhere riding my gravel bike, then the Diverge is definitely a good choice. It is a gravel bike. You can't go wrong with the Diverge. It'll ride on the road. It'll ride on the gravel. It's just that little bit of extra edge, thrill, and fast experience that you get on the Crux that I enjoy. Someone else did a comparison of these two bikes that I really liked, talking about kind of their thoughts on them. It really comes down to, you know, the Crux is that Porsche. The Diverge is going to be kind of, you know, your Toyota Land Cruiser. The Porsche goes fast. It can go off-roading, not the funnest experience, but it will. Whereas the Land Cruiser is going to be a very comfortable, reliable ride on either the road or the dirt. And, you know, you're going to feel more comfortable in that car. So take it for what it's worth, depending on what you want to do. Those are kind of my opinions of the two bikes and my thoughts on them. Why don't you take a look at where we're at out riding today? Just gorgeous. Perfect weather.